All right, quick question for you. When you hear the word money, what do you picture? Coins, notes, numbers on a screen? Because for most of history, money was physical, it was heavy. You could drop it on your foot and regret it. It was gold, silver, something real. And then in the 1600s, we decided we didn't really need that bit anymore. And once that happened, money stopped being a thing that governments had and became a thing they managed. And that's what this episode of The History of Money is all about. Central banks and the price of control. Now, gold sounds ultimately sensible, right? Stable, safe, responsible. Which is exactly why governments hate it. Because gold doesn't care. It doesn't care about wars, it doesn't care about recessions, and it doesn't care if your country's in trouble. And you can't just decide to spend more gold. And if you're a government, that's really, really inconvenient, especially if things are going wrong. So this is where central banks come in. They're often presented as boring technical institutions, but they weren't created to be boring. They were created to solve a very specific problem. How do we fund the state without constantly running out of money? Now, early central banks helped governments borrow, issue currency, and smooth things over when it got messy. And they didn't remove power from politicians, they concentrated it. Now, if you look back at the previous episode, we talked about paper money, the first paper money, not being real. Basically a receipt. A note that represented gold stored somewhere else. And as long as people believed in those notes, it worked. But here's the temptation. If people aren't asking for their gold back, do you really need to keep all of it? And that's the question that quietly changed everything. Banks learnt this lesson really, really early. They realised very quickly that money didn't really need to exist, as long as there was confidence. Deposits come in, loans go out, more promises than actual cash. And as long as everyone doesn't show up at once, it's fine. But when they do, that's when governments step in and say, right, we're not letting this collapse. And every time monetary power expands, there's a crisis involved. Wars, depressions, financial crashes. Rules get bent, gold gets restricted, and promises get quietly redefined. Always temporarily. And yet, the rules never quite go back as they were. After World War II, the world tried to split the difference. The US dollar was backed by gold. Other currencies backed by the dollar. It looks stable. But it only works if one country shows restraint. And historically, that's a big ask. In 1971, the US closed the gold window. No more redeeming dollars for gold. That's it. Money is no longer anchored to anything physical. And from this point on, money just became policy. Something to be adjusted, expanded, managed. Fiat money, as it's known, has value because the government says it does. And because you need it to pay taxes. It's enforced by law, it's managed by central banks, it's not backed by gold, and it's backed by authority. But to be clear, this isn't a conspiracy, it's an incentive. If money can be created easily, it will be. And the people closest to that process will benefit first. Everyone else feels it later, generally through higher prices. And that's not accidental. Every modern crisis looks the same. Interest rates down, money supply up. And the question now isn't whether central banks can step in, it's whether they can ever step back. When governments realised they didn't need gold, they gained an enormous amount of control. But they also removed the limits. And once limits disappear, alternatives start to matter. Because for the first time we can ask, what if money didn't need permission? What if it could be printed? What if trust was replaced by code? And that's where we're going next. I'm Patrick Wayman, a mortgage and protection advisor based in the East Midlands and your host for the History of Money. From barter to Bitcoin.